Welcome to the Littoral Zone podcast. I'm your host, Phil Rowley. The Littoral Zone, or shoal area of the lake, is a place where the majority of the action takes place. My podcast is intended to do the same, put you where the action is to help you improve your stillwater fly fishing. On each broadcast, I, along with guests from all over the world, will be providing you with information, tips and tricks, flies, presentation techniques, along with different lakes or regions to explore. I hope you enjoy today's podcast. Please feel free to email me with your stillwater-related fly fishing questions and comments. I do my best to answer as many as we can prior to each episode, just before the main content. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy today's show. Welcome to part 2 of my series, which focuses on how lakes work. As I mentioned in part 1, part of being consistently successful stillwater fly fishing is being in the right location at the right time, not only throughout the day, but throughout the season as well. As he did in part 1 of this How Lakes Work series, Brian Chan, good friend, mentor, business partner, passionate stillwater fly fisher, author, and fisheries biologist, will join me today for part 2. In part 1, Brian and I discuss lake classification and the different zones of a lake and which lakes and zones we as stillwater fly fishers should focus most of our attention on. If you haven't listened to this episode already, I strongly encourage you to do so. Today, in part 2, Brian and I will discuss the seasons of a lake: winter, spring, summer, and fall. We will go through each season with a focus on productive eutrophic lakes, understanding what happens within each season and how it affects fish behavior and location. Critical information to help you consistently find and catch fish. Well, Brian, welcome back. This is, if my count is correct, third time you've been able to join me, which I really appreciate. Episode 2, you were my first live guest, and we talked about chironomids. So if this is your first time listening to my podcast, I really highly recommend you go pick that up if you want to learn anything more about chironomids. This is actually part 2 we're going to talk tonight about understanding lakes. In part 1 we spoke about previously was the classification of lakes and the importance of pH and how that's used to classify different lakes. And we talked about the zones of a lake and all that stuff too. So both of those links will be in the show notes of this podcast. So if you haven't listened to them already, I strongly encourage you to do so. There's lots of great information there whenever we have Brian on. So Brian, if for those who perhaps haven't listened to previous episodes or unaware of your role and leadership and experience in stillwater fly fishing, sorry to make you do this again, but why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself, sort of how you got into fly fishing, and I know you were a fisheries biologist, maybe touch on that, your career, anything and everything that is Brian Chan.
Well, thanks, Phil, and it's great to be back on your podcast to talk about stillwaters and stillwater fly fishing and everything associated with it. It's your passion, it's my passion, and it's what keeps us going, I think. So I've been fortunate to live in Kamloops for the past 45 years or so, spending over 30 years as a senior fisheries biologist for the province, managing the small lake trout resources in the Thompson-Nicola region, which is in the southern interior part of the province. So it's an area of the province that's blessed with highly productive trout lakes and lots of them. And it's just provided a wonderful landscape to work all those years, to work on those lakes and to learn about how lakes function. And of course, it also helped with trying to figure out how to catch them. And so obviously my passion for fly fishing blended well with working as a fisheries biologist. And having that drive about fly fishing has led to a career in some guiding, fly designing, ambassadors for numerous fly fishing companies, and including boats, motors, sage rods, scientific anglers, fly lines, marlin boats, semperfly fly tying materials, and numerous other commercial interests. It's been a great ride, and you know, uh, I love talking about anything fly fishing, and particularly when it comes to understanding lakes and how they function, so that the anglers that are listening to this podcast are going to take away some key learning points that's going to help them in their journey and in fly fishing lakes.
Thanks, Brian. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, isn't it? We're going to talk about the seasons of a lake, just like we experience here on dry land. We get winter, spring, summer, fall. It also happens in lakes. And I think both of us, because you mentioned our passion for lakes, this really helps us, by understanding how lakes work, and particularly the seasons of a lake, it really helps us put ourselves in the right spot at the right place at the right time consistently. And that's so important, isn't it?
If we're in the wrong spot at the wrong time, we could be fishing water that's anoxic, like not enough oxygen for trout, or it's too warm. And so it's critical to understand the seasonal changes that occur within the water column. Absolutely.
So, yeah, we're going to talk about the seasons of the lake. We're going to talk about some key water temperatures in lakes that anglers should be aware of. We're going to talk about spring kill, summer kill, winter kill, all of those things. So, where do you want to start? You want to start with winter or spring? How do you want to go with this? Start with winter, maybe?
How about we start right now? It's the fall season. So this is exactly what's going on right now. So as you've mentioned, Phil, four seasons. And right now we're in the late fall season on our productive interior trout lakes. So again, for those listeners that took in the previous podcast on classification of lakes, we're talking about eutrophic lakes, the shallow, nutrient-rich water bodies, lots of shallow shoal or littoral zone to grow vegetation and to grow the food that trout love to feed on. So that's the background to the type of lakes that we're talking about. So right now, it's late fall and water temperatures are very cool. They're dropping. We're in the Kamloops area where I live. We probably got less than 2 or 3 weeks of fishing left before the majority of the lakes will be frozen over. So what's happening in those lakes right now is that water temperatures drop and continue to cool. They'll get to a point where the surface temperatures will become similar to the temperatures of the water in the deeper parts of the lake. And once those temperatures reach 39, 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 to 4.5 degrees centigrade, the water of that similar temperature will be a similar density as well. And the surface waters will sink to the bottom. And when you add some wind, that wind will mix that equally dense water from top to bottom. And that's a critical ecological event that occurs. So it's called fault turnover. The lakes will mix, and that mixing, which brings the bottom water up to the surface, drives surface water down to the bottom, that circulation event that happens over a number of days allows the lake to supersaturate with oxygen so that when the lake does freeze over in the next couple of weeks, the water will be oxygenated from top to bottom. So the lake will go into winter fully oxygenated, and ideally that's enough oxygen to carry the fish through the winter months. So when a lake goes in turnover, be it in the fall or in the spring, that mixing action as a result of the wind, it turns the water murky because it's bringing up water from the bottom of the lake, and as well it's bringing up detritus, sediment, mud up from the bottom, and it's mixing it throughout the water column. So when a lake is in turnover, it could have been crystal clear 2 days ago because you had good fishing. Go back 2 days later and it's very murky. That's a lake that's mixing. And the water chemistry then, during that mixing event, will not be very conducive to good fishing because there'll be a lot of hydrogen sulfide, methane gas mixed up into the water column, and it will put the fish off the bite, so to speak. So it takes several days up to a week for the water to clear. And then you'll get a little bit more fishing before the lake will know it's getting super cold now, and eventually it's going to freeze over.
We've talked about this before on seminars we've done together. You break the fall into 3 stages, don't you? You've got the right coming out of summer, sort of that early fall, and then what you're experiencing now when it's really cold and it's just, like you said, a week to 2 weeks before things, you put your boat aside and maybe get out the auger and the tent and fish a different way. So that's true, right? That's how you tend to look at it. Knowing that fall, how does that impact, where you're going to be and what times in the fall, as it goes through those 3 progressions?
There's early fall, as you mentioned, mid-fall, and then there's late fall. And the golden rule basically to follow is, as the fall season progresses, the fish are moving and feeding in shallower and shallower water. And that's just a very common occurrence in 99.9% of the lakes we'll be fishing. That cool and continually cooling water pushes the fish into shallower water and shallower water to feed, where they're chasing down shrimp or scuds, immature dragonfly nymphs, immature damselfly nymphs. They're looking for any remnant water boatmen or backswimmers that are around, leeches, and of course they're always opportune to graze on masses of zooplankton in the water column. But yeah, you want to keep in mind that as that water temperature drops, we'll be fishing shallower and shallower water. So early fall, we might be in 15, 16, 17, 18 feet of water. Mid-fall, we're going to be in 12, 10 feet of water. And then late fall, we're going to be 5, 6, 7 feet of water or shallower.
And that's exciting, isn't it? When I remember spending time with you fishing leech patterns or scud patterns in less than 5 feet of water and hooking a fish. It gets a little exciting. But not all lakes turn over, correct? The lake has to be deep enough to stratify, doesn't it, for turnover? So you get that difference in temperature, to set the stage for the turnover event.
Yeah, exactly. The lake needs to have enough depth so that the water does stratify during the summer months and then into early fall. But there are some lakes, particularly very shallow lakes, that basically can mix year round. They're just not deep enough to set any stratification. And as we go through the other seasons, this concept of stratification will become much clearer.
So I don't know about you, Brian, but I get lots of questions from anglers. Has the lake turned over? Is it lake turned over? And I'm always using, the water temperature as the barometer for that, because you see some people that say the lake's at 60 and it's turned over again. And these turnover events in these eutrophic lakes, and we'll get deeper into it, of course, when we talk about spring turnover, but they only happen twice a year. That it's not I think it's important for people to understand that it doesn't happen monthly or anything on that frequency.
There's 2 definite turnovers, one in the fall, one in the spring. Other times of year, lakes can get dirty because the upper layers of water could be mixing and bringing sediment from the shallow water out into deeper water, or you could get a small tributary creek after a heavy rainfall, bring in some murky water with suspended solids, and that would mix in the upper layers in the water column as well. But there's only 2 true turnovers, and that's fall and spring.
Yeah. Okay. So now the lake's gone into winter. The ice has come on the lake, and now we're in the winter time frame. We're all at home, frustrated, tying flies like crazy if the lake ice is over. And so what's going on once that cap of ice and snow gets on the lake?
So now that the lake has a layer of ice and then snow on the ice, and it could be 3.5 months, it could be 5.5, it could be 6, 7 months, depending on elevation.
That's my neighborhood.
Yeah. So the trout ideally, they're going to survive through the winter. But what's happening in the water column over the winter is, as the winter progresses, the oxygen levels from the bottom of the lake up start to decrease because you have a lot of anaerobic decomposition occurring at the bottom of the lake, and all that plant vegetation that grew all during the open water period is now dying because they're no longer photosynthesizing. And the decomposition of that plant material does strip oxygen out of the water column. So by midwinter, in many, many trout lakes, the deeper portions of the lake may not have enough oxygen to support fish life. And as winter drags on, that band of oxygenated water continues to shrink in size. So the fish are concentrated higher and higher in the water column. And by ice off in many lakes, the fish are kind of committed to just living in the top 10 feet, 15 feet of water, simply because any depths below that do not have enough oxygen to support them. And the bugs are going to be fine. The shrimp are happy. All the invertebrates are happy. But the trout have the highest biological oxygen demand in the lake, and they have to live where there's enough oxygen. And that's typically, as winter progresses, it's higher and higher in the water column.
Grand Teton Fly Fishing is a premier guide service and fly shop that has access to some of the most coveted rivers and lakes in western Wyoming. Their simple goal is to share their valued resource and have you experience a native cutthroat trout rising to a single dry fly in the shadows of the Tetons. You can check out Grand Teton right now at grandtetonflyfishing.com. Let them know you heard of them through this podcast. FishHound Expeditions offers world-class fly fishing right off Alaska's incredible road system. From monster rainbow trout to feisty Arctic grayling, you'll chase big species in the stunning landscape. Whether you're a seasoned angler or just starting out, their expert guides ensure an unforgettable adventure. Book your trip today before spots fill up and experience Alaska's diversity like never before. Check them out right now. That's fishhoundexpeditions.com.
And of course, a phenomenon can occur on our really productive lakes that are rich in weeds, not very deep enough to stratify. The Kamloops area in British Columbia ran into that the year before last, I believe, wasn't it, with winter kills. So what causes a winter kill?
So what happens with a winter kill? And a winter kill could happen early winter, midwinter, or literally days before the ice comes off. What happens is that amount of water that's anoxic or not supporting enough oxygen for fish life gets larger and larger. It includes more and more of the volume of the water in the lake, so that eventually it comes right up to below the ice, and there's not enough oxygen to support fish, and they die. They run out of oxygen. So the bugs are happy, the shrimp are happy, but the fish are going to succumb. They're basically going to suffocate from lack of oxygen. So it could happen, typically around Christmas time and early January, mid-January is a time when if we're going to lose lakes, that's usually the time frame when they start to run out of oxygen. So you can, we've done that as biologists, fisheries managers, they go out and check these lakes for oxygen as the winter progresses, and you can see the gradually decreasing amount of oxygen in the water column. And again, it starts out deep and then gradually works up through the water column. And hopefully there's enough for the fish to survive. But we've also seen where a lake has, at ice off, the fish are all dead, but they're very fresh dead. So they died just prior to the ice coming off. They held on all winter long and then just couldn't make it till the ice came off. So that's what happens with a winter kill. It can be complete, 100%. It can be partial, where the bigger fish who have a higher demand for oxygen die first and the smaller fish survive. And then you can have areas of the lake that the fish survive. There could potentially be an underground spring activity that is inputting some oxygenated water, and those fish that find it can hunker down over those spring areas and survive. So you can have complete kills or partial kills, and that typically is common to have various types of kills in any particular area of the province and other areas of North America.
Now, one of the fisheries management tools, we want to stay on seasons of the lake, but I think it's good to talk about it, is aeration. And that's done through the winter months to prevent winter kills, isn't it? So maybe you give us a brief description on what that is and how it's done.
So typically, I mean, aeration is a tool to try to prevent a lake from winter killing. Winter aeration is not 100% guarantee of bringing a lake through. So you typically, to aerate a lake, you need a lake that's at least 25 to 30 feet in depth. And there's different types of aeration, but the simplest type that's pretty common in the interior region of BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and into the western states are surface mounted aerators, which have a submersible pump hanging under a float and the pump is 2 to 3 feet below the surface, and the propeller is pulling water up to the surface and then spraying it up so that there's an exchange of oxygen in that water that's being brought up. So those are relatively inexpensive to purchase and to operate, but they don't always guarantee the lake is going to make it. The other typical aeration technology is to pump air from a compressor on land down through some rubber hose to a diffuser that's anchored below a big float. And it could be at 20 feet, 30 feet, depending on the size of the lake. And the air that comes out the hose is pushed through these micro-pored diffusers, ceramic diffusers, and the water bubbling up, or the air bubbles bubbling up, create a current as well as add a bit of oxygen into the water. You can further refine that type of technology by installing a nitrogen stripper and a second compressor that removes the nitrogen out of the air that's going through the hose, so that what's going through the hose is pure oxygen. And so those oxygenated bubbles are adding oxygen to the water as well as circulating the water. That's expensive technology, but it does not always guarantee a lake is going to make it through. So you have to think about aeration. It's a last stop effort to slow the natural eutrophication process of these lakes. So all these trout lakes that we love to fish, these shallow eutrophic lakes, over time they're gradually infilling. They're getting shallower and shallower over hundreds of years. And they'll get to a point where they're literally too shallow to support fish life. And so those lakes that we're aerating are on the border of being not able to support fish life. And the reason why these lakes are getting shallower over time is because all that decomposition of plant matter, it's settling on the bottom, and it's over time, the bottom is getting shallower and shallower. So I'm talking ecologically, we're talking over hundreds of years. And so we wish we could aerate lots of lakes, but it costs money. You need power. I mean, you can't rely on wind. You can't rely on solar. You need hydro to do it, or you need diesel generators, which really get expensive. So there's always trade-offs, but there's definitely many lakes out there that are worth aerating, as you know, in their area where you live. And when those lakes do make it, the fishing in the following year is going to be spectacular.
That's great. So, okay, Brian, so, we've talked about winter, what's going on, and now, fall going into winter, and maybe it's appropriate to talk about what happened in your neighborhood a couple of years ago when the fall turnover didn't occur, and how important that is, what had happened there, because it did have an impact on your fisheries, didn't it?
Yeah, and so 2 winters ago in the from the Caribou regions, southern, central interior, all the way down to the eastern interior regions of the province, we had a very warm fall and exceptionally warm October into early November, and the lakes never cooled down enough to get the same density to turn over. And then we had a cold snap in the second week of November, and the lakes froze. So they froze without fall turnover occurring. So just think about what happened. So the lakes froze. The lakes didn't get a chance to mix, didn't get a chance to be oxygenated from the bottom of the lake to the surface of the lake. So they went into winter with a narrow band of oxygenated water. The upper layers were oxygenated, but the deeper portions of the lake weren't. So it was going to be a tough winter because we're starting off with insufficient oxygen to make it through the winter for those fish. And so we knew we were going to have lots of winter kill, and we did. We lost lakes that never have ever winter killed. Total winter kills, big lakes, deep lakes that we never thought would ever winter kill, killed. And it was just a freak of, the fall weather we had and the exceptionally warm fall and then that cold snap, and they did not turn over. So this winter, this fall, we're looking really good everywhere in the province. Water temperatures are cooling down nicely. Lakes are mixing. They're frozen now in the northern parts of the province into the central regions, and soon to be frozen down where in the southern interior where I live. So hopefully we're not going to see very much winter kill at all this year.
That's good to hear. Okay, so spring arrives. The lake becomes ice-free. What's going on in the spring?
So the day the ice comes off the lake, if you were to do an oxygen profile, so like take the oxygen reading every meter down to the bottom, you're going to see oxygen in the top few meters of water, and then typically less and less as you go deeper. And in some cases, it'll be totally anoxic. So those fish at ice off are sitting higher in the water column, just like they did all winter long, because the day the ice comes off a lake, the water does not mix. We don't get spring turnover right at ice off. So the surface waters at ice off are colder than the deeper water in the lake. And the deeper water is warmer because all the anaerobic decomposition of plant matter during the winter months, one of the other byproducts, besides stripping oxygen on the water, it introduces heat. There's some heat as a byproduct. So the water is actually warmer at the bottom of the lake than at the surface of the lake when the ice comes off. So over the next couple weeks after ice off, the surface waters will gradually warm up till they get to the same temperature as the deeper portions of the lake. So once those surface waters gets to 39, 40, 41, 42 degrees Fahrenheit, they'll become similar to the bottom temperatures. You add a heavy wind event, and now the water is similar density, and the wind will mix it. It'll mix it just like it did in the fall. The bottom waters will be driven to the surface. The surface waters will get pushed to the bottom. The water will become turbid, and it'll take 4 to 5, 6 days or more, depending on how long it stays windy, for the water to become clear. But that mixing event, just like it did in the fall, supercharges the lake with oxygen for the spring and summer seasons.
So that's kind of the closest thing we as stillwater anglers have to runoff, isn't it? These turnover events. Not as far as water, just an unfishable, a challenging fishing situation due to murky conditions and fish just not terribly interested in feeding.
Yeah, exactly. If you're fortunate to be living in the interior and can follow lakes that just come off, just as the ice comes off, you can have some very, very good ice off fishing. And it's because those fish are kind of trapped in shallow water in a lot of instances. And so you'll be fishing 5, 6, 7, 8 feet of water, often no more than 10 or 12 feet, because that's where the oxygen is, that's where the food is, and those fish are hungry. They're happy they're alive, and we can have some great ice off fishing just following the lakes as the ice leaves those lakes. But turnover is eventually going to happen. It's a necessary ecological event, and once that turnover occurs in the spring, the waters will now start to warm up, and that'll introduce enough thermal heat units in the water to start the first insect hatches, which are always chironomids or midges. So the cycle of hatches start as those spring water temperatures, the surface temperatures get to the mid to high 40s Fahrenheit and into the early 50s. That's when we're talking prime time for those good spring chironomid hatches to occur, and those are then followed by or happen concurrently with mayflies, which are then followed by damselflies and then dragonflies and caddisflies. So that cycle of those hatches are all driven by water temperature.
And we mentioned in the introduction, two key water temperatures are that 39 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees centigrade. That's when water is most dense. It's most dense in its liquid state. That often initiates the turnover process or when temperatures are there. So that's a key barometer we can use with our thermometers to see, where the lake is in relation to that temperature and what might happen. And that close to 50 Fahrenheit, right? That's sort of in the spring, the trigger for your insect emergencies to really get going in earnest. And in the fall months, that's sort of the trigger that when the water's cool to that, trout are going to start feeding more and more aggressively until ice up.
Yep, exactly. That we all wait anxiously for those surface temperatures to get to the high 40s, early 50s Fahrenheit, 10, 11 degrees centigrade.
Yeah.
And we know it's time you better have your chironomid box filled out and ready to go.
But some anglers bemoan turnover, right? They go, lakes in turnover, like their whole world just ended for a second. But it's really critical for lakes to turn, isn't it?
Yeah, no, we need the turnover to occur in the spring, just as we did in the fall, because that spring turnover supercharges the lake with oxygen. The fish can swim anywhere. And that's why we have great chironomid fishing in 50, 60, 70 feet of water right at ice off on some lakes, because and those big lakes, there's still oxygen down that deep. But once those lakes turn over, the eutrophic lakes, it's common to have good chironomid fishing in 25, 30 feet of water because there'll be lots of oxygen down there. But that mixing and that supersaturation of oxygen helps the lake carry through to the summer months where there's, again, some more changes to oxygen levels in the lake.
So, Brian, one of the terms we hear bantered around, and you've talked about it, are spring kills. And what is the difference between a spring kill and a winter kill?
So what happens in a spring kill? So the fish have made it through the winter. The ice comes off the lake. The fish are concentrated in shallow water because there's not enough oxygen in deeper water. Then so they're alive for, up to a couple weeks till spring turnover event. So remember that spring turnover event mixes those upper layers of water, which are oxygenated, with the deeper unoxygenated water. And the end result is there's not enough oxygen throughout the water column to keep the fish alive. So the fish make it through the winter, but die at turnover, at spring turnover. And that can happen. I've seen twice in my working career where I was at a lake when it was turning over, very, very windy day, and watched every fish in the lake die within half an hour.
That must have been heartbreaking.
They just suffocated. They were beaching themselves, trying to find oxygen. It was really, really a violent thing to watch, actually.
Yeah, I guess. And a real key. So that lake, if I understand correctly, that lake you mentioned, like you can have a lake's winter kill within days of ice off, the really marginal state. But in a spring kill situation, that marginal lake managed to have the ice come off, and now they're in. If the turnover is not too aggressive, and that aggression is stimulated by wind, they can make it. But if it's a fast, aggressive turnover, that oxygenated water, what's left of it, is just distributed over a large area very quickly, and the fish just can't handle that.
Exactly. So ideally, you want the lake to turn over in the spring, but nice gentle breezes just to mix it nicely. The two instances where I saw a spring kill occur, there were 2.5-foot rollers coming down the lake. It was white capping. It was just a violent, violent windstorm, and it just really mixed it so quickly. It's just a freak of nature that it happened, and then that it would induce the total kill.
Every once in a while, Mother Nature likes to flex her muscles, doesn't she?
Yeah.
All right, so lake's turned over. The lake is oxygenated. Hatches are going. Fish are dispersed. They're free to move around vertically, horizontally, wherever they want to go. And then summer sets in. What happens next?
So we get through the spring months and the hatches, the natural progression of hatches is occurring. Then we get into the hot summer, 2.5 months, we're in the interior regions of BC and certainly in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and then the western states below us. Same thing happens. We get long, hot summers. So during the midsummer months, as the water temperatures warm up, you've got all that sunlight penetrating down and growing all those green plants. But the lakes develop thermoclines in during the summer months from all that intense heat. So the energy of the sun will penetrate down, 5 to 7 meters, and below that, it will have no warming effect on the water. So in the midsummer months, you get a barrier forming where the warm water meets the cold water below, and that's called the thermocline. It's a narrow band of rapidly declining water temperature, and that thermocline it's like an invisible barrier. It's like a sheet of plastic put across the lake at that anywhere from 5 to 8 meters in depth, depending on water clarity. And the wind can blow and blow, but it'll only mix the water above the thermocline. It's a very strong barrier to mixing. And this is what typically happens in 95% of the small trout lakes that we fish. So because there's no mixing below the thermocline, there's no input of oxygen. So there's always anaerobic decomposition occurring, and the oxygen levels can get low in some lakes below the thermocline, enough to the point where fish cannot live there, and they're going to spend the rest of the summer hunkered down just above the thermocline where the water's cool and better oxygenated. But in the majority of our trout lakes, there is enough oxygen below the thermocline, and the trout will be down there. If you turn your depth sounder on, it's in the middle of August, and all the fish you see are sitting, at 21 feet and above. You're not seeing any fish below. It's telling you that there's a good chance that there's not quite enough oxygen down at the deeper depth to support fish life. But you could go to a lake that's next door to the lake you're on, and it's a deeper lake, and there's lots of fish swimming around at depth. So every lake is a unique ecosystem, but in the most super productive lakes, the situation can occur where there's not enough oxygen below the thermocline to support fish life, but that is not typical, but it does happen.
Stay warm, stay focused, and don't let the cold dictate quitting time with Heated Core's advanced base layer technology. Hydro-Wick fabric wicks away moisture while undetectable carbon fiber heating elements target key areas to keep you dry and warm all day long. I had a troubling experience fishing a New York steelhead stream while in December. I was fishing it, and my feet, my legs, I was getting cold. I literally felt like things were freezing. I had to step out of the water, and I literally had to stop fishing. And then I watched somebody else take that steelhead. So never again for me. I'm sticking with Heated Core. Lightweight and unrestricting, you can stay on the water all day with 3 levels of heat and a rechargeable 7.4 lithium-ion battery. Heated Core may just be your ticket to more time on the water this season.
So I think some people think, once they trout head to deep water, they, right down just off the bottom, and that's not always the case. Your lake could be 100 feet deep or 80 feet deep or 50 feet deep. They're not necessarily, they will go out and suspend, won't they? Wherever they can find the oxygen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as if winter kill and spring kill weren't enough, we have summer kill as well, don't we? More of the price we pay for having productive eutrophic trout lakes. So what are we talking about with summer kill?
So our most productive lakes get blue-green algal blooms. So those anglers will identify with that when they look in the water and see these thick, dense masses of little round green dots in the water. That's one species of blue-green, and the other species looks like grass clippings in the water. Looks like someone mowed their lawn and threw the grass clippings in the water. Those are both blue-green algal species that survive and flourish in highly nutrient-rich eutrophic lakes. So there's lots of phosphorus, lots of nitrogen, and lots of sunlight creates the perfect environment for these algal cells to bloom into massive amounts that cover the water, and it can look pretty gross. So these blue-green algae have an interesting life cycle, a daily life cycle. During the day, the blue-green algal cells photosynthesize. So they're taking in CO2 and giving off oxygen. That's why all the blue-green algal cells are concentrated high in the water column, because they want to capture the energy from the sun. So typically when you're on a lake in a heavy blue-green bloom, the bloom does not go to the bottom of the lake. It's concentrated in the top 2 to 3 meters of water where it can still photosynthesize. So during the day, the blue-greens are creating oxygen. But at night, when the sun is gone, they switch gears and they respire. And at night, they take in oxygen and give off CO2. So what happens in a summer kill is that you'll have a heavy blue-green algal bloom on a lake, and you'll get some wind in the evenings, and it'll push a mass of these blue-green algal cells into a long, narrow channel or a shallow bay, and any fish that are in that bay in the evening hours, they may get caught in there because those algal cells are respiring and they're stripping the oxygen out of the water, and the fish will get trapped in there and they'll die. They'll suffocate from lack of oxygen. So that's what happens in a summer kill. It's always associated with a lake that has a heavy blue-green algal bloom. And at night, that respiration process strips oxygen out of the water, and fish can be trapped, and they get disorientated, can't find their way out into deeper water, and they suffocate.
And it's not as easy often to determine if that's happened, right? Because those fish, when they die, they just sink to the bottom. You don't have a lot of those visual clues that you do in the spring kill you experience. That's pretty visceral to see that. But you see the fish their bodies lying in the shallows, or lots of bald eagles standing on clear ice, looking through like they're window shopping. So it's not always easy, because we have a lot, and these algal blooms in recent years seem to have become worse and worse, particularly with lakes in my area, not necessarily trout lakes. We've got some walleye lake, whitefish lakes, and they, because of all of the recreational property and housing around those lakes and all those chemicals from fertilizers, get into the lakes and just really get the productivity levels and the nutrient levels up, and just more and more blue-green algae. You get health advisories, all those kind of things, isn't it? So lake pH, as we talked about in the previous podcast, it can change. It's not static, is it?
No, it's those blue-green algal blooms raise havoc in the lake environment. The public health organizations, put out advisories that you don't want to have your pets drinking the water out of those blue-green lakes, because when you get a massive bloom, it gets so thick that they die off because they can't all get enough sunlight because they're so thick. And so what you'll see is in a die-off of blue-green is you'll see slicks of turquoise blue-green paint.
Yeah, it looks like oil, doesn't it? It looks like oil, like an oil slick, or little concentrations of it.
Yeah.
It's quite...
And that is the massive amount of decomposing blue-green algal cells. Well, when it decomposes like that, and you see that blue-green paint on the water, that's highly toxic to mammals. And that's why there's advisories, you shouldn't be in there swimming. Your dog shouldn't be in there drinking. They can really get sick from that, and actually you have mortality from it.
Yeah, we've heard reports of ranchers losing cattle that have
Exactly.
gone in and, ingested a whole pile of toxic algae. So, but we actually, I think a lot of times people see that algal bloom. You and I have got some favorite lakes that get, that fish. We have those large chironomid hatches, bombers we call them, huge chironomid pupa where, 12, 2x, even 10 sometimes are massive. And yet that algae cap, if it's in moderation, actually helps. It absorbs that sun's energy and keeps the fish happy underneath where they'll feed on those all throughout the summer, and we can have some great fishing. So an algal bloom isn't necessarily a death sentence or something to put people off. It's a form of cover in some ways, isn't it?
You can have some great fish. We fish all summer long on lakes that are in full bloom
Yeah.
because we know that bloom does not go to the bottom lake. So it's clear below. And
Yeah.
we can have some great summer chironomid fishing. But you can also have such an intense bloom that it dies off. It's pretty ugly. It's not a
Yeah.
pretty scene to be out on the water like that. And by then, water temperatures are getting up high enough that you probably don't want to be
No.
out there harassing the fish because you may be catching and releasing and still having significant mortality. Because once those surface temperatures get above 68 Fahrenheit, you're risking harming or inducing death to fish that you fought for a long time and they just can't recover from the lactic acid buildup.
Yeah, they get acidosis, right? They cannot,
Yeah.
because of the lack of oxygen in the water, they can't get their systems back in balance, and they stress and they die. So they look like they swim off just fine, but a short period of time later, they're just going to succumb to that stress that we put on them. So yeah, that's when we need to go do some river fishing, if the water's still good there, or go fish for species that are more temperature tolerant.
Exactly.
So those are the seasons of the lake. We started off with fall, then we went through winter and spring and summer. And I think sometimes people go, okay, so what's the big deal? Why is this so important, Brian, to know this stuff?
It just so it tells you as we talked about first off on this podcast. If you don't understand what's going on, your fly could be in anoxic water.
Yep.
Fly could be in water that there's fish are not. If they're there, they're not very happy because of the water chemistry. We know that at ice off, the fish are going to be in shallow water in most situations because that's where the most oxygen is. And then if a lake is in turnover, we know the water chemistry is not good. The fish are not going to be happy. So if you arrive at your favorite lake and it should be crystal clear and it's not, it's there. You see all kinds of floating debris in it and it's murky. Then you basically have to pick a lake higher in elevation that hasn't turned over, or go down lower in elevation to a lake that's already turned over.
Yeah.
We have to remember that everything in lakes is driven by water temperature. So whether it's the chironomid hatches, the mayfly hatches, or damsel hatches, or the initiation of fall turnover or spring turnover or summer stratification, it's all water temperature driven.
Yeah. So in the spring, once the lake's turned over, the fish are pretty well dispersed because the lake is, oxygenated. They can move around, be in different depths. Then in the summer months, those shallow areas are going to be, because of the sun's energy, stripping oxygen, water temperature increases, less oxygen content. Those fish are going to spend very little time in those shallow shoal areas that we found them right after ice off or in the spring months, and they're going to retreat to that deeper water, as you said, near the thermocline, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, understanding that thermocline, and you can see it on your depth sounder.
Mm-hmm.
And so you know what that is doing, that it is a bit of a barrier to mixing. And if the fish are showing up just above the thermocline, then that's the sweet spot you want to be focusing your effort on. Because if they're not below the thermocline, there's a reason why you understand why they're not below the thermocline.
Yeah. And then, of course, in the fall months, you broke it into 3 sections, right? Early fall, mid-fall, late fall. And basically the fish as those temperatures drop, start sliding shallower and shallower and shallower and really packing on the feed bag, to give them the fat reserves to get through winter. So you had mentioned a couple of water temperatures that I just want to again make sure we stress the importance of them. And that's water is most dense at 39 Fahrenheit or 4 degrees centigrade, right?
Correct. And then when it's the most dense, that means it'll sink.
Yeah, and initiate mixing.
Yep, surface waters will sink. You add the wind and you get the mixing, you get the turnover.
So that's why your thermometer, again, you just stressed it again, is so important because, if your lake's murkied up at 55 Fahrenheit, it's not mixed. It's just turbid from other causes, like you mentioned, inflow streams, or maybe the lake's stratified over the summer months and that mixing is occurring in that upper layer of water, because when water's different temperatures, it won't mix. And of course, you mentioned 50 Fahrenheit too, both early in the spring is an important temperature and again in the fall. Why is that?
It's just in the spring, the 50 degree or 50 degree Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, that the waters below that, the deeper waters will be warm enough for the chironomids to be hatching. And in the fall, once the temperatures get below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, that the water in the shallower water is getting cool enough for the fish to move back onto the shoals, stay there all day long, and they're going to be feeding, because that is the biggest grocery store is on those shoal areas, that water less than 20 feet in depth, right down to just a few feet in depth. As long as that water has enough oxygen, those fish will be in there feeding.
Yeah, that's the cafeteria. That's where lunch is served. And we mentioned winter kill occurs when the ice is on the lake. Spring kill occurs during an aggressive turnover, kind of an exception event. Summer kill occurs in the summer due to high water temperatures combined with, or can be combined with, a serious algal bloom, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And not all lakes turn over, do they? The coastal lakes that don't ice over, you don't get the stratification occurring, right? The ice creates the stratification for spring turnover, but in the summer months, you can get that stratification occurring due to the sun and what we talked about going through the summer months, and then the lake will mix again in the fall.
Yeah, those coastal lakes that just don't get the heat that the interior lakes get, so the temperature gradients just never get established. There'll be very light thermoclines. They're very fragile, and the wind can break through and mix. Unlike the interior, where our summers are much hotter and longer, you get those very dense thermoclines building.
Yeah, because you were saying the water has to stratify, into two different temperature regions in order to set the stage for a turnover event.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, one of the things, I think I mentioned in the other podcast, but for the listeners out there weren't aware, when I wrote my Orvis Guide to Stillwater Trout Fishing, I had to get a chapter into the publisher within a very short time of signing the book contract. I jokingly say, I think so they could see that I could actually, write a sentence or put a paragraph together or articulate my thoughts in some way. So the first chapter I wrote, which is what the basis of this podcast and the previous one on lake classification was, the first one I wrote. It was the elephant in the room. It was the one that I had to get the science right. And thanks to you, Brian, because I sent that to you and you proofread it and with a few changes here and there, gave me the green light. So that book wouldn't have happened without you.
Yeah, no, that's all good. And I definitely recommend, listeners that want to read this in print, get a hold of Phil's Orvis Guide to
and your book too. The book you did with Skip Morris, fly
fishing trout lakes.
Fly fishing trout lakes. Yeah, that's where I went. And somehow I got it confused in my mind for a second with Jack Shaw's book, his trout lakes book. So, but you did an excellent job there as well, because I used that as a reference guide as well. But there's a really good reference guide on YouTube. If you look up the Oregon State University eCampus, the instructor there, professor I assume, showed how lake turnover worked with ice and dye and a hair dryer. And got was able to induce. And because of the dye in it, you can actually see how the lake mixes. And it's fascinating to watch. He actually is able to get the lake stratified. Then he uses the hairdryer to heat the water and also to simulate wind and adds dye. So I will put links to that because, it's about a 15, 20-minute video at that, or it's a two-parter, I think. But I'll put those links or link in there, and it really illustrates what Brian has done such an excellent job here today, talking about the whole turnover process and really sort of, I think visually a lot of people, when they see that, that makes sense now. So, yeah, this is a great resource. Okay, Brian, so obviously people want to get a hold of you more. How can they do that? Where can they reach you?
Probably the easiest way is follow me on Instagram at Brian Chan Fly Fishing, and you can message me on Instagram. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Yeah. I try to answer everybody that sends questions.
Yeah, it takes, I always say, I always answer them, sometimes right away, because if they build up, it's just, it's a tough slog to get them through, or if you're tied up on the water, you're probably too busy to answer there, unless it's a slow bobber down day, then you got time to
exactly.
To you also have a website too, right?
Yeah, it's riceformflyfishing.com is my website. I'm probably more active on Facebook and Instagram though, and I try to put posts up that provides a bit of education in the post, so it's fun doing those.
Yeah, it is. So, and you also are guiding. Are you still guiding, or is that?
Yeah. I'm still doing I'm still guiding on trying to slow it down a bit every year. But I'll be. I just finished up another season of guiding, and I'll be back at it next spring. But definitely trying to cut back and reduce the workload a bit and a bit more relaxation fishing.
and then I give you a call and say, hey, Brian, let's do a stillwater school. So Brian and I also do stillwater schools. For the last few years, it's been out of Corbett Lake Lodge near the town of Merritt, which is about an hour south of where Brandon, that's my son, Brian lives. Those fill up fast. You can always check out my website for that. I'll put the links to that, philrowleyflyfishing.com, for those as well, because Brian and I enjoy getting together. It's a chance for us to do a little pre-fishing in the interest of study, but I think we're just having a chance to catch up. But great time to be with us. We're on a secluded lake, so we can get people in our boats and do some real good quality learning experiences on the water too. So those fill up fast. So if by the time you hear this and schools are full, it's not our fault, right, Brian?
Yeah, I know that. Those schools are a lot of fun, highly educational, catch lots of fish, and learn a lot. So I look forward to doing those schools with you every year, Phil.
Yeah, I'm glad you're still saying that. All right. So again, Brian, thank you so much. I hope everybody really enjoyed this. One of my favorite topics to talk with Brian about is understanding. Every time we have a discussion, I learn new things about lake limnology and biology and lake ecology, important things to know, and important as stillwater fly fishers you should know too. So again, check out the lake notes for many of the references we put in there. And until next time, get out on the water and wet a few flies.
Yeah.
Take care, Brian. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Phil.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode, the final one in my two-part series on how lakes work. I don't know about you, but I find Brian's knowledge, understanding, and passion for stillwaters infectious. After listening to today's episode, I hope you better understand on where to focus your efforts throughout the season, such as fishing shallow right after the ice melts, the difference between winter and spring kills, how summer kills occur, why algae is not always harmful, and the importance of 39 degrees Fahrenheit and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. If you want to learn more about stillwater fly fishing and how lakes work, I encourage you to pick up a copy of my book, The Orvis Guide to Stillwater Trout Fishing, along with Brian and Skip Morris's Morris and Chan on fly fishing trout lakes. Each book is autographed and is available at mine and Brian's Stillwater Fly Fishing Store. You can find our store at stillwaterflyfishingstore.com. Links to our store will also be included in the show notes. Also, don't forget to check out the show notes for links to Oregon State University's eCampus 2 video set on lake stratification. These are excellent videos and do a great job of explaining and showing you how lake turnover occurs.